Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Digitally Transformed. I am your host, Melissa, and today I have a lovely guest who you may recognize his voice. I've had him on the podcast a handful of times, and he is so full of knowledge and just very easy to talk to. His name is Stephen Webster. He's an executive advisor here at Infused Innovations. And our last couple of podcasts that we recorded together were all about the Great Resignation. We recorded a part 1 and a part 2. But the conversation was so good that I had to have him on for a part 3 to continue this discussion about how the culture of modern work is still constantly changing every single day, even since our last podcast recording. So, Stephen, I am so happy to have you on the podcast again. How are you?
Melissa, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me back. I certainly enjoyed our first 2 podcasts, and I'm very much looking forward to this one today.
Well, good. You are awesome to have on the podcast. I know everyone enjoys everything that you have to say. So let's kind of hop into what we're talking about. The pandemic was responsible for accelerating this path to what a lot of people would call the future of work, right? Modern work. And we've already started to move down this path with more flexible working arrangements for employees. But the pandemic significantly accelerated this journey. So talk to us a little bit about what was kind of going on and what has been going on during this time in the workplace.
Sure, Melissa. If you think about companies like Infuse, right, we had already adopted a hybrid work or a work from home sort of a model as a business. And there were a number of businesses beginning to do that. So you were starting to see sort of what the future of work is because of the incredible connectivity that we now have. You're starting to see businesses that say, okay, I still want my employees to come to the office every day. We had businesses who said, you know what, I'm okay with a hybrid work, come to the office occasionally, but it's okay to work from home. And then we have businesses that are sort of on the other side of that, which is complete work from home. And there are certain industries, Melissa, that you can do that in. In technology, you have the option to do that. If you're running a restaurant, you really don't have the option to do that. If you're running a retail store, you really don't have the option to do that. Although, omni-channel and all of that stuff is now in play in a much different way than it was before. So what you've really begun to see is those businesses that can move to more of a hybrid or work at home. We hear the term accelerator all of the time and how fast things are going. Well,
Right.
What the pandemic really did is it just turbocharged those existing patterns and moved us a lot faster down that journey than we were moving before. And I think now that everyone has a sense of it and a feel for it, it seems to be moving faster. It's kind of interesting watching some of the other companies saying, well, now you need to come back to work. Or the other day I was reading an article, Melissa, where they were talking about giving the individual managers the accountability as to whether their employees had to come to work or not. So, trying to empower individual teams to make a decision. I would like my team on site 1 day a week. I would like my team on site 2 days a week. There are a lot of things, right, such as a strategic session or a planning session or a scrum session for if you're running a team, being in a room, whiteboarding stuff, getting together and collaborating on that is really, I think, still a more effective method than trying to do that over Zoom. So finding that right balance between in-person meetings for things that are critically important in person versus being able to then do the work from a remote location or any remote location, right? And I think that's the other spirit of where employees are really pushing back is, and I don't necessarily want to work at my desk at home. I'd like to work on a beach in the Caribbean, or I'd like to work on the top of a bar in Nashville where you just
So. Of course. Why wouldn't you want to do that?
Why wouldn't you want to do that, right?
I'm curious, do we have any stats or do we have any sort of understanding with what is happening with employees, why they want to resignate? I mean, what's really going on? What is the research telling us?
So many things are really still around, Melissa, the traditional issues of bad management, right? So 63% of people actually don't leave companies. What they do is they leave their manager. And when you think about if you have a bad manager and you're already working for one, and then you layer on the complexity and the communication challenges of moving from being in an office to being remote, those managers, unfortunately, even the good ones were challenged, but the bad ones were really challenged because they just weren't equipped with those skills, right? Those management skills that are needed to manage their employees remotely. It's a completely different type of a management by, when I was managing in the old school days where everybody was in the office every day, it was basically management by walking around was the way most of us did it. Hey, Melissa, how you doing today? How's everything going? Hey, Jeff, can I help you with this? Or people would just walk in. So there was this ongoing kind of collaboration.
More accessibility to understanding where people are at.
Right?
Yeah.
Or if they needed help immediately, you could help them. Or if you just wanted to touch base with them, or just talk to employees that you wouldn't normally talk to. Those were a lot of tools that great managers would use, right? Today, we have a lot of awesome collaboration tools, right? We use Teams all the time. We've got Slack, we've got Zoom, but they're really communication tools. They're not necessarily tools that are well suited for employee management. So this remote work has really eliminated the opportunity to engage with the employees. The other thing as well, too, is people had a chance to take a step back and reflect a bit on their lives. Is this really the job that I want to do? Is this really the opportunity that I want to do? So I think there's also been a lot of personal reflection that has gone on for many, many employees over the course of the last 18 months. So it's the convergence of all of these things, whether it be bad manager, bad tools, bad experiences. I think the opportunity to, you can read a lot more about entrepreneurship today than we were ever able to read about years ago. So there's a lot of things that can stimulate you as an individual to think differently than the way you've historically thought about your job.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like what you said. You said people don't leave the organization, they're leaving their managers.
Right.
And that is so poignant and so true to so many of the stories that I've heard from friends and family who they're like, I'm not breaking up with my job. I'm breaking up with my manager because they were micromanaging me. And so I think that's really important, which kind of cues into the next thing I want to talk to you about, which is mental health and the mental health of your organization, which is so important. This is one of the larger issues that has been actually, gaining attention in modern work. Mental health is a huge growing issue for all employees. And we really, really saw this, especially during COVID. Even from a cultural perspective, we saw a lot of memes about people who were, drinking on the job or staying in sweatpants all day. And, a lot of this is because there were so many changes in personal, social, and work life in the world. And the world is still, quite frankly, changing every single day. So, Stephen, talk to us about how organizations can better support their employees' mental health, and talk to us about the importance of also just having that basic awareness in the first place of needing to be cognizant of your employees' mental health and why that's so important.
Indeed, Melissa. And to just put some context around it, right? What we're talking about here is the fact that, 20 million people departed the workforce, right? 4.3 million departed the workforce in August. So it's not just because of a bad manager. It's not just because you feel the need that you want to do something else. A lot of it has to do with the stress that you related to it and the sort of this blurring of the lines between always having to be on at home, always having to be on the job, the stress that has created, the anxiety that has created. So I was reading about a recent study by a company called Martech, who used this emotion intelligence tool to survey 1,200 people across the US. And what they did is they ended up defining those respondents in 4 different segments, Melissa. The first was this thriving employees, where they found that 16% of employees had greater job satisfaction, greater company satisfaction, greater motivation during COVID. This group, interestingly enough, though, is more introverted than others. So you could see where if you are more introverted, being able to work by yourself at your home without having to interact with all of your coworkers, you can see where that would be extremely beneficial for them and help to support that thriving employee model. One of the things, Melissa, that I found myself challenged with during COVID is I'm very extroverted. I'm sure that you can't tell that from any of these podcasts.
Never. No, not at all.
One of the things that I needed to teach myself was how was I going to generate my own energy, my own nuclear power plant, being at home every day as an extrovert, whereas when I'm in the office, I plug into people. So extroverts are folks who plug into people to get their energy. Introverts are folks who kind of have their own nuclear power plant inside. They don't need other people to generate their energy. And we were talking earlier today around, sometimes we might get a little tired in the middle of the afternoon. Well,
yes.
we don't, as extroverts, we don't have anybody to plug into, so we have to generate all of our own energy on ourselves. So that was something that I certainly had to learn from, and I can fully support that. The second group is this hopeful employees group, right, where you have very high company satisfaction, but here's where people are starting to begin to deal a little bit with struggling with that focus, that productivity, that mental health, because there's so much coming at them. If you think about this great resignation, the number of people that left, the work still needs to get done at these companies.
Right.
So work has then cascaded down to the remaining employees as they're trying to then fill and backfill and fill that knowledge void of people who have moved on. So 25% of employees are these hopeful employees. So the third group, Melissa, is referred to as the discouraged employees. And these are the folks who actually have the most significant decline in their mental health and their job satisfaction. This group, as I mentioned, like myself, is much more extroverted than others, right? So they're having a hard time being home or being hybrid or being remote. And then the last group is referred to as the trapped employees. So they have the lowest company satisfaction with mental health. They really miss the office. They really miss socializing in the office. So when you do the math on this, Melissa, essentially you've got about 40% of people who are on the top half, which are thriving and hopeful, and 60% of employees that are more discouraged and trapped employees.
Wow.
So what you're really seeing here is this mental health is a growing issue, really, for all employers, regardless of your industry or your age or your seniority level. This mental health is taking a toll on employees. We've seen a lot of that in sports too, right? We had Simone Biles, and we've had a number of other very high profile people who are feeling stresses of life, right? Here we're talking about stresses of work and stresses of life, but we are beginning to see a lot more awareness around this particular issue and this particular challenge. Employees are struggling with the stress and the focus and that productivity, with 40% of people saying that these aspects have gotten worse since they started working at home in the pandemic.
Wow. And I know that we're going to talk a little bit more about things that organizations can or should be doing to support their employees. But before we do that, this podcast is really an extension of the last two episodes where we chatted about the Great Resignation. And before we move into that, I want to continue to talk just a little bit about the context around this, the Great Resignation, and how it's constantly shifting and molding. And even since our last podcast, we've seen changes in what the modern workplace means and what the Great Resignation is and how it's transforming and transpiring right in front of our eyes. So can you talk to us about that and how it's still moving and shaping and shifting?
Oh, indeed, Melissa. There's it's even different for different demographic groups, right? If you look at baby boomers as an example, a lot of baby boomers who were close to retirement said, you know what, I'm going to retire early. I'm going to move out. And so you've had this giant wave of also talented managers, talented mid-managers and folks like that who decided to leave the business for a variety of different personal reasons, whether it might be their health, right, or whether it was the stress associated with it. According to YPulse, right, when you look at Gen Zers, 62% of Gen Zers want the future of work to look like a hybrid setup. So their specialty, right, and what they're trying to get is how do they find that balance between working in the office and working at home. The same is true with the millennial group. Although the millennial group would still prefer much more of a hybrid mix than a remote or office work. So a lot of different dynamics in different segments as well, Melissa.
Yeah, and recently we heard Satya Nadella say something along the lines of, it's not just the great resignation, this is the great reshuffle. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, you've got a lot going on there, right? Because people, just like anything that's new, when it first gets out there, it gets dubbed with a term, right? So the Great Resignation happened to be the great term that everybody wanted to write about. And then if you Google it, there's 8,000 articles or 10,000 articles about the Great Resignation. But even since the last time we spoke, which was just a few weeks ago, people are really beginning to rethink what's going on, looking at more of the root causes around what's driving that, right? So yeah, it's true that many workers are rebelling against crappy jobs, lousy bosses. But the underlying root cause of the strife, if you think about it, Melissa, is that earnings have really stagnated for a very long time. If you think about it, we're talking about the $15 minimum wage or the $12 minimum wage. But there are so many people that are working for wages, and our real wages, when you include inflation, right, it's become really hard to balance that budget as depending upon the income that you're making, right? So real wages have barely budged for decades when you look back at it, while technology-driven scheduling and skyrocketing healthcare costs, skyrocketing childcare and education costs have made life much more precarious, right, for a good portion of the workforce. The pandemic really, Melissa, was the fuse that lit this candle. It said, you know what, all I'm doing is I'm running on the treadmill, right? And I'm not making any progress. And there's a lot of these forces that you can't control as a family, as a head of a family, right? How do you control your health costs going up? Or what things does your healthcare no longer cover that it used to cover, right? Or how high is the deductible? Because from a business perspective, right, the business says, I can't absorb 40 and 50% increases in healthcare costs. So what I do is I push those down to my employees because it's the only way that I can afford it, right? So workers up and down that income scale are really rethinking their work for very deeply personal reasons. They're not only rethinking how they work, but why they work and what they most want to do with their careers. The pandemic really chipped away from the sort of work normal and forced us to confront really deeper truths about what we want out of our lives. Workers are trying to reshuffle themselves into positions that better align with who they want to be, right? We want to support companies that are socially responsible. We want to support companies that are aligned to our values. And this generation and the younger generations, it's a great wave that's happening around being able to drive for those values and to do things that are important for our fellow human beings, our environment, the things that are really, really critical, and hopefully we're starting to tackle about that. So it's really not just about the hybrid work solution, Melissa. It's around how their values line up with their jobs and the companies that they work for.
Yeah, I really love that. So many things come to mind. I mean, first and foremost, one of the reasons why I love working for Infused Innovations is because I have that flexible work schedule. I get to work from home, and let me just paint a picture. I'm a single parent and I am my son's only parent. And so me being able to wake up, have breakfast, with him, I can hop online. I can have already done an hour's worth of work before I even drop him off at school on my computer. I can drop him off, have that flexibility to come back home. Maybe I can even pick up some groceries I need to pick up on the way, get back home. I can work. If I'm feeling anxious, like you and I were talking about this before, we started recording for the podcast, but if I'm feeling anxious or I feel like I need some vitamin D, I need to get outside, I can go take a walk. I can call a friend. I can take that moment, and that makes me not only a better person, but a better worker. And then along what you were saying in terms of needing to have a company that is more than just money, a company that has purpose and that has ethics and values. And we do here at Infuse Innovations. We care about the ethics of AI. We care about AI for good. We care about the planet. We care about all of those things. And for me, that as an employee makes me feel like I'm a part of something bigger than myself. And so those two big things have already improved the quality of my life. The flexibility and that feeling of having more, that feeling of having that purpose. So I really, really, that resonated with me a lot. I want to ask you, because we've talked a lot about, the context of what's going on. We've talked a lot about the issues. We've talked a lot about how employees are unhappy and all of these things. But tell me, what is their job? What is it that they can do to help solve these issues in the workplace? What should their next step be in this phase of the great reshuffling or the great resignation? What is it that they have to offer to the workforce, or that they should be offering?
Similar to what you just said, Melissa, and you touched on it, right? It is about organizations creating that purpose, creating that meaning that their employees can believe in and respect, giving their employees that purpose, that they're the company that they want to work for because the values are connected, right? We were talking earlier about the speed of change and how fast things are moving and how difficult that can be for many, many employees, right? So, but every company has to have a real growth mindset in their organization, right? This is really grow or die is where we are today, right? The disruption in all businesses is completely different than it's ever been before, right? Nokia a few years ago was the number one cell phone manufacturer. They didn't compete with Apple until Apple introduced the smartphone, and then Nokia basically went out of the cell phone business, right? So there's all sorts of dynamic change and technological innovation that forces us to just think differently, and having that type of a growth mindset is important both for the leadership of the organization, but engaging your employees, your most important asset in that process, right, is what value are you creating for your customers? So focus on that value creation. What value are you creating for the economy? What value are you creating for society? What value are you creating for the environment, right? These are all very important things that business leaders now need to think about that maybe they didn't need to think about as much years ago. How transparent are you? How comfortable are you with transparency, right? There's a lot of folks who are sort of command and control type of managers. Well, this is a tough time to be a command and control type of manager, because the likelihood of you being able to relate to the younger folks that work for you is probably going to be a little bit lower. Right? How do I make sure that I'm always touching base in a meaningful way from communication? Not just, Melissa, how are you? It's more around, Melissa, how are things going in your job? Or is there anything that I can do with your job? Do you see any areas or opportunities to improve your job? If I were to give you one or two or three things that would turbocharge what you do or make your job easier, what would they be, right? That's a different level of dialogue than, how was your weekend, Melissa? Or what do you think about the Rams? Or what do you think about, some other baseball team or something like that?
Even though I will say it is nice and it is very important to have those basic human conversations instead of
Absolutely.
just jumping into a meeting.
Yes. They are important from a social perspective, but how important are they from you being really continuing to grow and improve in the organization that you want? It's a two-way street, right? Employees are demanding, hey, I need more training because things are moving faster. So please provide me with training so that I can stay here, right? I need for you to provide me with more compassion and more empathy so that you understand my personal situation and can help me get through that. Being emotionally intelligent, right? Being able to recognize things that a lot of people can't recognize. These are becoming those softer skills of leadership, Melissa, that are critical today and are going to be much more critical as we move forward from a leadership perspective.
I agree with that. And I think, too, especially in the modern workplace, when you're not in person and you can't always pick up on the nonverbal communications or cues, you do kind of have to go a little bit out of your way to ask those questions. But I think that's okay. And I think people need that. Mm-hmm. So we talked a little bit about how Satya Nadella calls reshuffling of employees, but he also calls it this gigantic opportunity for businesses and says that they can and should be jumping on board. How do you feel about that? Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, Melissa. From an opportunity, whenever there's risk, there's opportunity, right? So for those businesses that wake up and figure out that these are important in order for me to attract high quality employees, there's a lot of great organizations like Microsoft who figure this out and they move on. But not everybody's Microsoft, right? And not everybody's Apple. So you've got a lot of businesses who may still be stuck in some of those old ways of doing business. And they're going to really have a hard time in the next decade or so staying in business because of their inability to attract that highly talented employee to their organization. Now, one of the things about smaller organizations, is that they can be more nimble, they can be more focused, they can provide more opportunities, they can let people grow in different ways. So having the ability to do that and having the ability to provide that type of an environment for smaller or medium-sized businesses, I think is going to be very attractive to a lot of people moving forward, and a lot of potential employees moving forward.
I know everything's changing day by day with how quickly technology is evolving. So do you have any last minute thoughts?
Well, Melissa, great problems offer great opportunities, right? At the end of the day, we're going to solve this thing. And, when we really think about the challenges that this poses for employers and managers, it's really my belief that our society has and will continue to benefit from this crisis. I believe that being able to recognize that our employees and our friends and our family, let them focus more on their health and well-being, let them connect to their family and friends, let them be able to find a job anywhere in the world. You don't have to drive here or drive there to do it. You can do it from anywhere. And to really just get back to the basics of that emotional intelligence and that relationship that you have with your employees. A lot of this is just common sense, Melissa, and I think this great sort of reshuffle and this pandemic that we went through hopefully slaps us in the face a little bit and gives us a perspective that says, you know what, treat humans with respect, treat them with dignity, give them a fair pay, train them, do all of the things that great companies way before now have done. But now all of the small companies and large companies have the opportunity to do that for our employees and our workers.
You know what, Stephen, that makes such a great point. I think the fact that we are now having so many more conversations, we've created a dialogue that really, I don't want to say it didn't exist, but I just don't feel like it was getting very much attention. We lived in this world where you worked from 9 to 5 and that was it. And you were sort of a machine behind your computer. And I think now we're realizing, hey, employees are humans and humans work better when they have more flexible schedules, and managers who have more emotional intelligence, and when they have more ability to choose in their roles and all of those things. So I think it's just so good that we're having these conversations. And, it takes people like you to be able to come in and say, hey, this is something that's going on. It needs to be changed. We need to talk about it. And I always appreciate being able to sit down and have these conversations with you because they are so, so, so important.
Thank you, Melissa. It's always my pleasure to spend time with you.
Well, thank you for coming on, Stephen. I will see you, I'm sure, another time on this podcast.
I look forward to that as well.